Hello. I imagine we might have a few latecomers, so they can catch up with the intro stuff and pick up in a few minutes. But I just wanted to welcome everybody today to this BFI Network at London Film Festival case study, in which we're going to be exploring one of the debut features playing as part of the festival. My name's Simran Hans. I'm a writer and film critic for The Observer. And today I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Yemi Bamiro, who is the director of One Man and His Shoes. The film played last night. It's a documentary about the cultural and commercial phenomenon that is Michael Jordan and the Air Jordan trainers that were associated with him, still are associated with him. It's a really kind of interesting way in to sort of talk about culture and sport and politics and race through an unlikely subject, I guess. Yemi is a creative producer and director who's worked in film and television for over 15 years. He's directed and produced a variety of music, sports, arts, and specialist factual related documentaries for TV and online. And his broadcast credits include Channel 4, Viceland, BBC 2, BBC 4, Sky Sports, and MTV Networks Europe. We're going to chat for a little bit, but there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. You can do that using the Q&A function rather than the chat function. And if you just put your questions through, we'll answer them throughout. And hopefully today's session will give any filmmakers watching a sense of kind of your journey, Yemi, and sort of making the jump from working in TV, making shorts, that kind of thing, into getting your first feature off the ground. I want to start by asking you, at what point, at what age, where were you in your life when you decided you might want to make films?
It was pretty late on, I'm not gonna lie. It was maybe about 18. I think that for a long time I thought I wanted to be a writer. I was convinced I was going to be a music journalist, and sort of I started writing for a Black British newspaper when I was doing my A-levels called The Voice, and I'd sort of like write at The Voice like one day a week, and I was working on the arts desk, and I just get to do interviews and write little features and review stuff. And yeah, I just kind of thought that I wanted to do that. And then I kind of, after university, I kind of like had a bit of a change of heart. I kind of thought that, yeah, I'd always had an interest in film and TV, and I kind of wanted to explore that. So I kind of got I got an internship at MTV when I graduated. And yeah, MTV then, the onus was still on music, and it hadn't gone all reality TV at that point. So yeah, it was good because, you know, it was sort of like film school, because there were lots of people the same age, and you were sort of just thrown in to kind of like work your way and navigate it. You had to be able to shoot and edit and sort of like write scripts for presenters and stuff. So yeah, it was like a kind of like it was like a form of like film school. You kind of just picked which one you were like really good at or gravitated to. And I just always enjoyed like filming stuff, like going out and filming stuff. And I stayed there for about 5 years. And I think after university and that experience pretty much solidified the fact that I kind of wanted to make, films or just make TV and you know, just kind of like make my own stories or whatever. So that's where it pretty much started.
What did you study at university, by the way?
I studied American Studies and History.
So it's interesting that your kind of grounding and your background is in writing and research and journalism, and kind of being able to identify and construct a narrative, which is so important for filmmaking. And then the practical stuff you kind of learned trial by fire through this first job, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I kind of like loved my degree because I've always been obsessed and sort of like fascinated with America since I was, a teenager. And I think I wrote my dissertation on the Black Panther Party, and, you know, it was like 12,000 words, but it never ever felt like work. It was just kind of like, I'm really interested in this subject and I get to read all these incredible books and just kind of like, you know, form a thesis around like the Black Panther Party in the 60s or whatever. So, yeah, I was always, you know, I always liked writing and research, and I kind of feel that that's served me like really well, you know, kind of working in TV, and because it's, you know, all those skills are transferable. There's a lot of research, a lot of kind of just digging and finding out what stories are there and what's compelling and what will work and what won't work and characters and stuff. So yeah, the practical stuff was, I think the practical stuff was, I don't want to say easy to learn, but I think it was, yeah, I think you're around lots of like-minded people around, you know, that are the same age as you. It's really easy to sort of like just fall into something or just gravitate to something quite naturally. And I think that's what working at MTV definitely did.
So how long were you at MTV for?
For 5 years.
So talk us through kind of the trajectory of those 5 years. You know,
Mm,
it's quite a substantial time to be in one place.
mm.
How did you progress in those 5 years, and who kind of supported you along the way?
So I worked on, so it was when MTV had their own channels. I think they still do. And I worked on MTV Base, which was predominantly like hip hop, R&B, and yeah, just like black music basically. And the channel was basically run by three guys, and they were a bit older than me, but they were, you know, they championed me completely. They were like really supportive. And so I started as an intern, but I was already, you know, I got an opportunity to write scripts as an intern. I was sort of like logging transcripts, writing scripts, and soon I was kind of like doing interviews with contributors. And then and then I would sit in the edit and sort of like watch those guys put the stuff together that we'd shot, or, you know, I'd done interviews for. So you got to see this kind of like, you know, full circle perspective of like how to construct something, whether it be like a short 2-minute VT or like a 30-minute show. So yeah, the trajectory was like pretty decent. It was kind of like intern and then like researcher and then AP, and then towards the end I was kind of like directing episodes of like The Lick, which was kind of like the flagship MTV based show that Trevor Nelson used to sort of present. Sorry. So yeah, it was really it kind of worked out there. But you know, I've loved music, and it just felt like, it never felt like a job. It just never ever felt like a job. It was kind of like, you know, I would do this for free, even though like the money wasn't great.
Definitely shouldn't be doing it for free.
Yeah, no, I in my head that was always my kind of thing. It was just kind of like, you know, I would do this for free, and the money is just kind of like a bonus. That's always been my thing. I've never been massively motivated by money stuff. It's just kind of like, what kind of like enjoyment am I getting out of being in this position? And I think, you know, early on, sort of like early 20s, it kind of felt like there was no better job to have than sort of like working in TV and working, you know, in a genre that you really, really love. So yeah, that's pretty much how it worked out.
I think that's really kind of interesting and worth noting that you sort of say that you weren't motivated by the money, because I think first of all, a lot of people are.
Mm,
And secondly, that kind of impulse to not want to be necessarily making loads of money, and so not being driven by that meant that you made the film differently, right?
mm,
Because your first feature is independently produced,
mm,
and you know you were working on it for 7 years,
mm,
and so the journey of that it is different than if you had sort of had other pressures from
mm,
sort of other kinds of funding bodies.
mm,
Want to get into the detail of that. I think it would be really useful for the filmmakers
mm,
listening. But maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about the transition from working in TV and working in kind of you know, making commercial videos and
mm,
then directing your own project. Because
mm,
by this point in your story, you know, if you've been at MTV for 5 years, you've
mm,
grown a lot of confidence, you've got the
mm.
skills, but it still takes something else for you to be able to kind of make a feature from that. So
Yeah.
how did this film begin?
Okay, so this film sort of like started, I want to say, I remember it specifically. It was November 2012 when I started thinking about, you know, making something long form, because at that point I'd worked in TV for like maybe 8 years, maybe 6. I can't remember. But
where had you gone after?
After MTV, I kind of just worked as sort of like a gigging sort of like PD, producer director. So I worked at a company called Lemonade Money, who, you know, they still make a lot of, you know, youth orientated music content, really, really incredible stuff. And I kind of like directed and produced a BBC Two Saturday morning show called No Hats, No Trainers. And that was sort of like presented by Mr. Jam, and it had its own unique sort of aesthetic from a visual perspective, and it was just really courageous and brave, and there was nothing else like it on TV at that point. And you know, I really loved doing that. And after that, I was sort of like doing stuff for Vice as well, and then I took a staff job at Sky, because I kind of perhaps was a little bit fatigued just doing music stuff, and I kind of thought, oh, perhaps I should, you know, be exploring other stuff. And I'd always been into sport, so yeah, I went and I went to Sky, and I worked on their Formula One channel, Sky F1, and I stayed there for 3 years. And I did that because of the fact that I thought it'd be good to sort of just have that experience of working in like a big corporation. And then I'd always loved F1, and I thought, oh, I'll get to go to the races, and that'd be cool, and I'll get to make F1 content. And that's pretty much how that worked out. But then, you know, when I was there, I really missed sort of, you know, the stuff that I'd grown up making. So I'd missed music stuff, or kind
more cultural stuff.
Yeah, more cultural stuff. I think there just felt like pretty one-dimensional F1 in terms of like how you tell the stories. And yeah, so I left after 3 years, and I went back to Vice. And then it's when Vice launched Viceland, which was sort of, you know, their documentaries on TV. Basically, it was their kind of like their channel. And then just made lots of sort of like human interest films, like worked on a series called Gaycation with Ellen Page, which is pretty cool. Worked on a series called Black Market, which sort of like looked at illicit black markets around the world. And we made a film about transgender hormones, the sale of transgender hormones in Vietnam. And like just really incredible, compelling stories, you know, that, you know, I probably wouldn't have had the chance to make if I'd stayed at Sky. So I think, yeah, the whole time I was doing that. So this was post. So when I got to Sky, I was kind of like working on the film or thinking about the film. But in 2012, November, when I had the idea, the film was going to be about Air Jordan collectors. I was convinced that I wanted to make a film about Air Jordan collectors because I'd never seen a film like that before. I'd seen films about sneaker culture, but I'd never seen anything that kind of like profiled Air Jordan collectors specifically. But then I kind of realized quite quickly that that probably wouldn't sustain like 85 minutes to 90 minutes of a feature-length film. And then that's when I started to think about the origin story of Nike and Michael Jordan, and, you know, the byproduct of that being Air Jordan sneakers. And that's pretty much how it all came together.
I want to know what it was about November 2012 that you remember so vividly.
Okay, I remember. So it was 6 months before my 30th birthday, and I'm a bit of a film buff in terms of like, I love reading about directors, I love sort of like the making of films, and I love all the stories and sort of anecdotes that go behind that. And, you know, just, you know, I'd always heard from reading all these books about directors about how important it was to make a film by the time you're 30. Like, you know,
Okay.
all kind of like directors had made films. You know, some of my favorite directors had made films by the time that they were 30. So I guess I had like this weird sort of crisis in myself, and I started to panic, even though it's completely ridiculous. But, you know, that's kind of like, you know, that's why I remember it. I remember where I was, and I remember having this like quite clear thought process. And yeah, and then I kind of started to think about the idea, and I kind of thought, oh, there might be something in that, you know. And then I did actually start making that film about Air Jordan collectors, like, and some of those collectors are actually in the film. But so I put together like a 9-minute short film on these collectors.
As a kind of teaser or something.
As a teaser, yeah, because I kind of like, so I'll backtrack a little bit. So November 2012, I put together like a 3-year plan, and I kind of said to myself that in 2013 I would like make this teaser. In 2014 I would try and find money to make the film based on this teaser that I shot, and in 2015 I would make the film. And that was like my 3-year plan, because I just knew that as an independent filmmaker, like with like this lofty idea about, you know, Air Jordans collectors, I'm not just going to be able to make the film. Do you know what I mean? It's going to take some years. So yeah, I put this 3-year plan together and sort of just pursued it basically. And yeah, it's probably about, I don't know, 4 years out maybe, because the film's just coming out now and I was meant to have it finished in 2015, but yes.
Hey, it's here, it's finished.
It is finished, yeah.
I am really interested to hear about the process of that, and I think I'd like to talk about the research aspect of it and kind of to hear a bit of the timeline of that. But first, I want you to tell me about two guys called Will Thorne and Michael Marden, who you made the film with. You know, I've heard you speak about your collaboration with them and how they were attached to the project very early on. And your face lighting up the sound of their voices or the mention of their names tells me a lot already. But I think something that's really important for filmmakers, particularly independent filmmakers who maybe don't have loads of infrastructure at the early stages of their film, I think it's so important to talk about collaborators and how you kind of build your team of people who are going to help you see the project through. So tell me about these guys, how you met them, and how you guys started working together.
Okay, cool. So I met Will at Lemonade Money. So when I had left when I'd left MTV to sort of like just be a gigging sort of like director.
And Will produced the film, right?
Will produced the film. So I met Will at Lemonade Money, and he was another PD. He was a producer director. And as soon as I met him, we just had this connection, because he just loved film as much as I did, and he'd always had ambitions to make his own film as well. So we would just like go and watch films together. We talk about films. We just had this, you know, we just hit it off straight away. And Michael is a good friend of Will's, and he's just kind of like an extension of, you know, me and Will. He's a massive film buff. He'd always wanted to make a feature film. Like, he has like impeccable taste when it comes to stuff, and we all just kind of like hit it off. But to backtrack a little bit, you know, so I'd made this short film on Air Jordan collectors, and I hadn't really got a lot of traction. And then I remember meeting Will one day in Kennington Park. I remember this vividly. And, you know, I kind of was a bit depressed about the fact that no one really cared about this trailer that I'd made or whatever. And he was like, "Oh, I'll help you with it. Like, it's a really good idea. We should make it." And yeah, that was pretty much it, you know. And then he sort of like introduced me to Michael. And then I met Michael, and you know, Michael was just, like I said, he was just like one of us. And yeah, that's pretty much, you know, the film wouldn't exist without those two guys. You know, you have to surround yourself by like-minded collaborators, and then people that just believe, you know, like 100% in the idea and believe in getting it across the line and getting it finished. Like, you know, they're my friends, and it's been a really tough time making this film. It hasn't been easy, and it's been like really stressful, and you know, there's been, you know, we've had setbacks, but yeah, incredibly we're all still friends and we all still get on. And yeah, so I think perseverance and just surrounding yourself with the right collaborators is just kind of like that is key to all of this, because I couldn't have done it by myself. You know, I needed Will, I needed Michael, and Michael's also the editor of the film, you know, as well as one of the producers. So yeah, it just wouldn't exist without them, but it exists because we just believed in this project. We believed in the idea, and we sort of, yeah, we had the perseverance to stick with it, even with all the setbacks.
So we'll get to the setbacks. We'll go into them, but I want to kind of backtrack a little bit and think about the research process, because the film is like very detailed, and it kind of covers quite a broad stretch of time.
Mm,
And you also use a lot of archive, and
mm,
the archive is kind of done in a really interesting way. And a lot of it is kind of a lot of that archive story is told through animation as
mm,
well. And so
mm,
I'm interested to know kind of what the research process was like, and how
mm,
long you sort of spent doing that research before you went out and started finding contributors and talking to people.
mm.
And also to sort of hear a little bit about the archive, and whether you started with it and then built the film around that, or used it to sort of fill in after you'd done other things.
Yeah. So in terms of the research, I think um, it kind of, the making of this film sort of feels a little similar to sort of the way that I did my dissertation, where it didn't necessarily feel like work, and it was a subject that I was naturally interested in. So yeah, I did I read a lot of books, but I also weirdly just had a lot of this stuff in my head. Do you know what I mean? Just through kind of, this story kind of like takes place from, I'd say, like the late 70s all through the 90s. And I was born in 83, and I came of, I was kind of like growing up in the 90s, where, that's quite central timeline to this film. So a lot of it was just, I was aware of it. And then also because I'm a massive hip hop fan, and I love rap music, it was sort of, those two things felt like interchangeable. The NBA in that time, Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls franchise, and then just like what Nike were doing, and the rise of Nike. So yeah, I mean, I read a lot of books, and I kind of, but it never felt like work. It never felt like I was researching. It just felt like, I
I
was
guess like
trying. Go on.
I was
Sorry.
gonna say, I guess for anybody who kind of wants to make a film, and might be watching, and like you, wants to make something that they're really passionate about and they may be already an expert in,
Mm,
I'm kind of curious to know how you organized all of that knowledge that you already had, because you're right, like you grew up in the heyday of hip hop, and like
mm,
you already had so much context.
mm.
But it's one thing to like know it, and another thing to sort of use that in a sort of practical sense to tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of sort of,
Did you have
there
loads
were,
of Google Docs? Did you?
yeah, there were lots of paper edits, and there were just sort of like lots of documents like with themes and ideas on them. And I think that, Will and Michael were like quite integral in that process, in terms of like just bouncing ideas back. And, the central kind of like idea of this film is like the phenomenon of Air Jordan trainers. We wanted to tell this like definitive sort of like history of this shoe, but then also we wanted to explore other things. So it was almost like, if you've got a piece of paper and you're kind of like, you have like Air Jordan phenomenon, in the middle of your page, and then you've sort of like got offshoots of other things like politics and race, 80s America, 90s America. It was just about connecting, the central story to those ideas, and then almost like not going too far away from that central idea. And that, I always felt quite comfortable with that, because I kind of like knew the story loosely, and I knew kind of like the ways in which the sneaker had impacted some of those other things, i.e., the political landscape of the film, or like the racial element of the film, or what was going on from sort of like America and a marketing perspective. So yeah, I guess it was, I don't want to say it was easy to navigate, but it wasn't as difficult as, the film perhaps suggests, because obviously there's a lot of stuff in the film. It can probably feel like a little bit like information overload. And I also put that down to the luxury of time. We made this film over the course of 7 years. So that's a lot of time to keep coming back to something and refining something, and sort of like, almost just making sure that the ideas and the things that you're trying to say are as clear cut as possible and accessible as possible. Just because I'm a fan of something, there could be kind of like this, I could go down a rabbit hole, because I assume that because I know it, everybody else should know it. And I think, Will and Michael were really good at kind of like, helping me to keep on you know, this kind of like central idea about what this sneaker is and how it connected to other things.
Were they on a level with you in terms of sort of pre-existing knowledge and interest, or were they more kind of learning about it as they went along the process?
I think they learned about it as we kind of, you know, went along. When
That's
I
quite useful then, having people who are like maybe not as deep in it in the same way.
100%. Yeah, because I would have to explain like stuff. So for instance, when it came to the contributor list, I knew, you know, I've still got a document from like 2013 with a list of contributors, and we pretty much got every one of those contributors in the film apart from Spike Lee. And you know,
Did you guys try and get Spike Lee?
Yeah, we did try and get Spike Lee, but you know, I'm just a random guy from South London, and Spike Lee's a, you know, Oscar-winning, you know, director. So it was, you know, right. We tried, but it's fine.
You say that now. That's in 2020. Let's see how we go in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that contributor list. How did you find all the people that are used as talking heads in the film? I know you sort of mentioned at the beginning that the film changed shape because it was originally just going to be about collectors, and then it opened out into being more of a kind of broader cultural commentary. But yeah, how did you assemble that list, and how did it change from 2013?
So the list didn't change, I don't think. I think perhaps there were more, it was going to feel more like a sort of a cultural sort of like story around Air Jordan sneakers. So there were more kind of like people that, you know, were influenced by from the trainer from a cultural perspective. But then when I realized that it needs to be like an origin story of Nike, you know, that's pretty definitive, and there's not many people that were around, you know, when that was happening. There are sort of like, you know, there are a handful of people. So I think it all sort of started with a guy called Roland Lazenby. Now Roland Lazenby is he's an author, and he wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Life. He's Michael Jordan's biographer. He wrote The Life, which is, you know, probably the most definitive text on Michael Jordan. And he had to speak to everybody, obviously, when he wrote that book. And he was one of the earliest people he was one of the earliest interviews that I did. And that was in like 2014. And I went to Virginia to interview him, and it was like a snowstorm, and I had to go to this Marriott hotel, and because I couldn't get to his house because the roads were like treacherous. So he said, like, don't come because I don't think you're going to make it. So meet me at this Marriott hotel. And then they gave us the conference room, and that's where I did the interview. So, you know, we'd already sort of like gone through this thing to even get the interview. And then he's just an incredible, you know, he knows everything, obviously, because he's written this book, and we just really hit it off. And I think that, I don't know, he perhaps saw something in the film or the project, and he was really instrumental in helping me introducing me to Sonny Vaccaro, who is, you know, the college basketball scout who, you know, convinced Nike that Michael Jordan was the guy to go with. So he kind of introduced me to Sonny. But even after he introduced me to Sonny took like 2 years to get in he took 2 years to say yes, to agree to be in the film, to be filmed.
Why was he hesitant, and how did you convince him?
So again, luxury of time. I would just I would just email him every 6 months, and just, you know, or whenever I was in America shooting, I would just basically say, I'm in America, like, how do you feel about doing this? I think he was hesitant because, I don't know, he probably gets asked to be in lots of people's documentaries about this subject because he's quite integral to this story, you know, like, you know, Sonny Vaccaro is that he was the guy that basically, you know, engineered some of this. So yeah, he probably gets asked a lot. I mean, he's got his own ESPN documentary, a 30 for 30. So yeah, he's a pretty high profile guy. And yeah, so it goes back to the luxury of time. I would just email him literally every 6 months. And yeah.
Did you have a sense in your heart that he was going to say yes?
No,
I didn't. Or were you just chancing it every time? I
would just kind of like thought, well, you know, he said no this time, but maybe he'll feel differently in 6 months or 8 months, and I just kind of, I'm not a person that goes away easily when it comes to this film, because I think that, you know, you can't be a person that gives up easily when you're trying to tell something, something like this. So I just kept knocking on his door every 6 months, and thankfully he said yes. And yeah, I kind of ended up interviewing him twice on 2 different occasions. So, and yeah, he's an awesome guy. In relation to how we got the other contributors, Russ Bankston, who is quite an authoritative voice when it comes to sort of like sneaker culture, specifically in New York, he was so generous with his time, and I kind of knew him through a friend. A friend introduced me to him. Yeah, DJ Clark Kent knows Russ Bankston, and he knows Babito Garcia. So it basically was this domino effect, that if you approach people, the first thing they're going to ask you is, who else have you got? And I think that the moment that we were able to build up sort of like a pretty impressive, like high caliber, list of contributors, it became a little bit easier. And that's how we basically got David Stern and David Falk. But then also, to backtrack a little bit with Sonny Vaccaro, even though he eventually did say yes, I knew that perhaps, I need to show him how important he is to this story. So at that point, we'd had lots of other people in the film talk about him. So what we did is we stitched together like a little 3-4 minute kind of, piece of, of all these contributors talking about him. And I think, he appreciated that, because it was just a level beyond of, just randomly emailing someone. It's just like, look, like, it'd be really hard to tell this story without you. Like, we've got all of these people who were around at that time that you kind of collaborated with and worked with. Like, here they are talking about you. And I think that definitely helped.
I want to talk about money and the kind of practicalities of getting this film off the ground and getting it financed. I think for some sort of early career filmmakers, especially if they're kind of producing independently, making the films independently, it can be really hard to know what the ballpark is, or that ballpark is always like so kind of changeable and different. Sort of how did sort of drawing up a budget for this film work for you, and kind of did you have to adjust your expectations at any point?
No, I didn't have to, because I did. It was complete DIY filmmaking in terms of, myself, Michael, and Will all work in TV, and what we would do is we would go away and sort of like do a TV job, and then come back and put our money in a pot, and then go to America and film. So we self-funded the film for many years, and it was to the point that only I could go. I would never call myself a DP, like I'm a sort of average cameraman, but I knew that it was essential that I would have to shoot stuff and shoot interviews, which I sort of hated. It's never ideal to sort of like rock up like a one-man band and have to shoot an interview and then do the questions as well. So yeah, we kind of like, in terms of expectations, we just kind of like had what was there. Do you know what I mean? And it was bare bones. The setup was like, bare bones. In terms of a budget and getting it across the line, I think that, yeah, independent filmmaking is really hard. And there are not many sort of like organizations or bodies who are just going to give you a pot of money. And even those organizations and bodies are sort of like inundated with like applications for funding. And we knew that. So it was just kind of like, well, let's just try and make the story ourselves and self-fund it.
So you totally sidestepped kind of even applying for some of those schemes or pots of money?
We applied for a little bit of BFI money, and then we did get it, but it was a tiny bit of money that went towards, I think, it felt like a lottery win, that, to be fair. We were all really chuffed when we did. It was like the documentary film fund before it went to Doc Society.
Okay.
Now it's with Doc Society now, their film fund. But yeah, it's incredible. I think, it's really competitive and they reject a lot of stuff. So we felt super honored to be able to get through. But, it was at a time when the fund was in transition. So it's just before it went to Doc Society. So yeah, it was hard to navigate because, yeah, we got some money, but we didn't necessarily get enough to finish the film. We got enough to sort of like keep us in edit for a little bit of time, but it was, yeah, we still needed loads of money. And I think we basically found a producer in an NCT class that I attended with my wife when my wife was pregnant. Yeah, this is I want people to understand like how independent filmmaking works, and it's just a complete lottery. So yeah, 2017, we went to NCT classes like 4 months before, like, you know, our daughter was due to be born, and I met a guy, and we just really got on. He lived around the corner from me, and you know, we'd kind of like meet up and talk about Arsenal because he was a massive Arsenal, and we just connected. And then I ended up telling him about the film, and he was just kind of like, oh, that sounds like an incredible idea. I've always wanted to invest in film. And at first I was just kind of like, no, man, like, you know, you've got a wife who's going to have a baby, keep your money. Like, but he just would always kind of like nudge me about it and ask me about the film and how's it going. And like, so then I introduced him to Will, and sort of we had a chat, and yeah, he was like really serious about it. He was like a self-sufficient guy, business guy, done pretty well for himself, like through his own business, and just a bit shrewd. I think anyone that invests in films is like shrewd and sort of like, you know, they're clued up, and they know the risk that, you know, potentially that they are getting into, you know. And he, you know, became our exec producer. He gave us some money that allowed us to basically finish the film. And
that's incredible.
yeah, and that's how we, so go to NCT classes basically, because you never know who you're going to meet.
I think that's a really important lesson to keep in mind about being open-minded and being able to, at any given moment, communicate like with clarity what the project is and your passion for it, because you never know who might be able to help you.
Yeah, no, completely. I think he's an incredible guy. His name's James Rancolia, and he's just, he's a friend of mine now. We're friends. It's, you know, but you just never know. But that's the reality of, you know, independent filmmaking. It's just so hard, man. And like, I think there were so many moments when we were making this film, like myself, Will, and Michael, we were just like, how does anything get made? Because it's just like, it's insane. Like, you know, it's so competitive. And I think that's where that persistence and that sort of like DIY approach needs to sort of like kick in, because you can't just expect people to like read your application for funding, or like read your application or even get through the rounds of funding. You know, I think you need to be realistic in that sense. And but I also think that the film is better because of the time that it's taken to make it. I think if in 2013 someone would have given us a pot of money and said deliver this film in 2015, it wouldn't have been the same film. You know, I think we had that luxury of time to revisit things, to revisit contributors, to revisit the story, and just to sort of like make sure that we were telling it in the right way. And I think ultimately we had autonomy as well. You know, we had creative control. We didn't really, I think that, and that's the kind of like an advantage of not necessarily having paymasters. We kind of made the film that we wanted to make, and we didn't really have to answer to anybody. And I think, you know, that's quite intoxicating, to be fair. And like, you know, we think about how it's going to work, you know, if we get an opportunity to make another film, and like we do have paymasters, and how we navigate that. But yeah, I never underrate, you know, that feeling of just being able to make, you know, your film the way you want to make your film. I think it's an incredible privilege to sort of like be afforded that, because not everybody has it, especially their first film.
I think, yeah, it must make such a difference with it being your first film as well, because it's before you are kind of not second guessing yourself, but then responding to how people perceive you, or, you know, how people have responded to your first film. Like that will inevitably kind of shape how you make your next thing. So I think having that independence is really valuable.
Yeah.
I'm conscious that we haven't had any questions, and that the participants might be a bit shy. Feel free to push through any questions on the Q&A function if you have them for Yemi. We can carry it on talking, but I think, you know, if you have any questions, please do send those through. we touched on it before. We didn't really get to it. I
Mm,
want to talk about the archive,
yeah.
and how you built that into the film. I'm really curious to know whether you used the archive to structure it,
Mm.
or whether you kind of filled it in after you already had a kind of a structure and a narrative in place.
Yeah, it was the latter. I think the archive came much later, and I think the archive considerations also fed into sort of like the whole visual aesthetic of the film, because you mentioned about the animation. Like, we knew early on that we wanted to use animation, and we knew that because of the fact that we wouldn't have, we couldn't afford all the archive that we basically wanted to use. So we wanted to find some sort of like stylistic way that we could allow the animation to do some of the heavy lifting that this archive would have done if we were able to afford it. So yeah, the archive definitely came later in the process, and it's a minefield. Like, Will, was across that, and he's a hero for being across that, because I think, clearing stuff and sort of, fair dealing stuff, and navigating that is pretty much a gray area. You need a really good archive lawyer, and that's where a lot of our money did go, because obviously if you don't have clearances, you can't use the stuff. So, archive lawyers and lawyers just generally are worth their weight in gold when you're sort of like telling a story like this. And yeah, they were able to give us guidance on, what we could and what we couldn't do. So um, and then also us working in TV, we kind of like knew some of the archive rules and regulations, like, but I think having a lawyer, really definitely helped us out, and made everything safe, basically.
Yeah, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit more, in a bit more detail about the animation, because I love how
Mm,
that's used in the film, and I think it's really fun, and it kind of adds to the pace and the energy
yeah,
of what you're trying to do, and the sort of 80s, 90s
yeah,
new money explosion that
yeah, yeah,
was happening at the time. I like how that's mirrored formally.
yeah.
Um, you sort of said you're interested in animation before. Where did that interest start, and how did you decide to use it here?
Okay, so when myself and Will worked together at Lemonade Money on No Hats, No Trainers, that a lot of that show had that sort of like style and feel. It had like this, quite frantic personality from a visual perspective. Like, just, it was really exciting and quite engaging to watch, and I was always massively into it. And then when I went to Sky, I met an editor slash, animator, illustrator called Will Newell, and he basically helped me with the short film. So he's, to credit Will, he's been in this process as long as Michael and the other Will. He's an incredible sort of like VFX illustrator. And yeah, that first short film that we made together, we put a lot of that visual style in that short, just so we could show people. But yeah, we always knew that we wanted to sort of include that, because I realize that it's quite a dense story, and there's a lot of people talking and telling you this information. And I kind of wanted to punctuate the stuff that the contributors were saying in an interestingly like visual way. So we knew from quite early on that we kind of like wanted that style. And then also we wanted that style to mirror some of the themes of the film. The film sort of like has a personality and has a pace. And we kind of like wanted, the animation and the graphics to sort of like, complement that personality and that rhythm and that pace.
We've had some questions through.
Yeah.
Um, so there are a few that are about fair dealing, so I'll kind of group those together. Um,
Mm,
so someone asked whether you use fair use policy when using archive, which you've said that you did.
yeah.
And then there are a couple of questions saying, how do you deal with issues of validity and accuracy with the information? So how did you go about, I guess, with making a documentary,
Mm,
it's necessary to do a level of fact checking, and how
mm.
did you approach that?
Just
Uh,
lots, like, so just tons of research, like all the reading, and obviously, and then just the contributors. So like, if we're talking about the Air Jordan 1, which sort of like started this whole thing, there were only maybe like 3 people involved in, you know, the kind of like the production and the sort of like the launch of that shoot. So Peter Moore, a guy called Rob Strasser, who's no longer with us, he passed away, and yeah, and then there's Sonny, you know. So I think it was like it was a back and forth with those guys, like lots of emails, lots of conversations, and obviously we couldn't get Rob, so we spoke to his widow, Julie Strasser, who also worked at Nike at the time that, you know, Rob was basically launching the Air Jordan 1, and Nike was sort of like on the, you know, like just about to kind of like sign Michael Jordan. And it was just about making sure that all of these stories kind of like aligned, and if there were any sort of like holes, that we were able to sort of like press them on it and ask, you know, like why there would be a discrepancy in this particular story, or like where does this come from. And
Doing
it was
like
just
thorough cross-examination.
yeah, it felt like that a little bit, because there weren't many people in the room, you know, there weren't many people that were sort of around when all this was happening, and we pretty much got every single one of them, apart from Rob, obviously, and Spike. But we got Jim Riswold, who was the executive at Wyden and Kennedy, who called Spike Lee up and asked him to sort of like direct the Spike and Mike adverts. So, you know, Jim was pretty crucial in all of this, because yeah, he was kind of like working on the Nike account as a Wyden and Kennedy executive from quite early on. So yeah, lots of cross-examination, and just we weren't afraid to sort of like probe things that, you know, perhaps we'd read in a book that didn't add up. But you know, when you're reading a book, it's from someone's perspective. You have some interviews, and you know, it's easy for things to get lost in translation. So yeah, lots of cross-examination and just probing stuff, basically.
It seems like you're saying that it's really important to also have multiple sources, and to not sort of
100%.
rely too heavily on any one person or any one text to
100%.
like fill in all of your information. And the more you read and the more people you talk to, the broader and more accurate a picture you'll have.
Pretty much, yeah.
There's a question from B Manzini. Says, hi Yemi, you talked about being a one-man band at times in terms of filming some of the earlier interviews. And I'm conscious of how you built a rapport with your subjects and your own confidence, which I think is a really like interesting and kind of useful question, right? How do you, when you're by yourself, when you have limited experience, you had experience in a kind of TV context, but in terms of telling your own story that you wanted to tell, there's a lot of pressure on you to go out there. If you've paid the money, you've flown over, you've done the transatlantic flight, and it's just you and your camera. How in that moment do you both have the confidence to deliver what you're going to deliver, and also at the same time build this human connection with the person in front of you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that when I worked at MTV, a lot of the early stuff that I used to do, I used to just go out with a camera and just film stuff. So I remember doing stuff like with grime artists, and it would just be me and my camera, and like, you know, you've got to kind of, you're there to sort of like do a job and build a rapport. And I don't know, I think it's, you know, I remember I made this documentary on Skepta for Channel 4. They used to have this late night music slot called More 4. And, you know, we shot over like the course of 6 weeks, like him getting tattoos, him in the studio. I'd be in the studio for like, you know, until 3 o'clock in the morning, or like he had a gig at Fabric out on Boxing Day, and I left my family to go and film him by myself at Fabric. And it was just like showing him that, you know, I'm you know, I really want to tell this story, like I'm really invested in this. And I think when you haven't met anyone, you have phone calls and you have emails, so you can sort of like do a little bit of that heavy lifting that way. You know, I think phone calls are really, really important. I think, you know, the third act of the film like deals with a contributor called Daisy Williams, and yeah, Daisy, you know, it took kind of like 6 months for Daisy to even talk to me on the phone. You know, we exchanged emails, but she wasn't ready to talk. And then, you know, when she was ready to talk, we spoke for a while. And then I went to Houston to sort of, you know, the idea was just talk to her. It wasn't even to film her. And like, yeah, we kind of like we were in the airport hotel for like 2 hours just talking. And then, you know, she felt comfortable enough to sort of, you know, allow, she was willing to share her story and, you know, the what happened to her son. So I think it's just about, you know, I don't really know. I've always liked talking to people, and I've always liked sort of like just understanding the reasons that people make decisions, or I just have an interest in people, you know, and I really enjoy stories, and I kind of, and characters, and all the sort of like the layers that come with that. So it must be something in that. I don't know if that's a definitive answer, but I've just always enjoyed talking to people, which is why I've always like wanted to make documentaries, because I'm fascinated with people and stories. And it sounds like a cliche, but it's just something that I've always been into. So I think when it comes to, you know, the subject, I knew this subject pretty well. So you bring that enthusiasm to, you know, this, when you're kind of like going to talk to contributors, you know, the story, you sort of like know the things that you're going to ask them. And I think people can sense that enthusiasm, and they can sense that passion quite early on. You know, I wasn't just there sort of like reading questions off a piece of paper. It was kind of like a lot of it was percolating inside my head, but you know, I just had a natural sort of like curiosity about these people and like, you know, what they did. And I think perhaps there is a kind of like an unsaid thing that, you know, that communicates that to them, basically, I think.
Yeah, just being a genuine person, having that genuine enthusiasm in all of the interactions that are to do with the film, it seems to be a theme that has carried you through, whether it's in the antenatal classes, or trying to find a producer, or whether it's behind the camera trying to get your contributors to sort of tell you their truths.
Yeah.
There's an interesting question from Gemma Price, who says, do you have any advice for first-time documentary producers? As a director who works closely with your producers, maybe you have an insight on that.
Yeah,
or I guess maybe like another way of phrasing that question is, you know, if you're a first-time documentary producer, you're probably looking to collaborate with a director. So
yeah.
how do you kind of link up with people?
Yeah, okay. So I think that you can't necessarily be shy. Like, I think, and what I mean by that is that if there's a director's work that you really like, you know, perhaps they haven't made a feature film yet, or maybe they have made a feature film, or you enjoy their short work, like just get in touch with them. And I think everyone's got an ego, and everyone sort of like likes that ego being flattered. And I think that, you know, if someone kind of like messages you, or kind of like sends you a nice email saying that, do you know what, I've watched this film that you've made, I really love it for these reasons, I really like some of your other work, it'd be good to kind of like, you know, get a coffee or get on a Zoom call or whatever. Like, you just have to sort of like put yourself out. And, you know, I think if you're a producer, you're kind of like seeking collaborations with directors or like other filmmakers. And I kind of feel that, yeah, you just have to be quite forthright in identifying the sort of like filmmaker that you want to work with, and then not being afraid to sort of like hit them up and, you know, just tell them, you know, what you think, or what your tastes are, or like what you like about their work, or, you know, how you could possibly collaborate with one another.
I think it's interesting to think about it that way around, because so often people think that the producer is always going to be the more experienced one facilitating the filmmaker. But of course, you know, collaboration can work both ways.
100%, yeah.
There's a question from a friend of the network, Beth Webb, and she says, hey, Yemi, how have you found that the film is being received by people now it's out in the world? And I have a kind of like a tag on question to that, because, you know, the film was supposed to premiere at South by Southwest, and of course, due to COVID, that festival didn't happen. So now it had a sort of I don't know what the word would be, an arrested kind of start, kind of getting into the world, and now people are actually seeing it and able to kind of feed back to you. How have you found the reception?
I think the reception's been like good so far. I mean, I find the whole thing just like super surreal. Like, you've got to understand, like, this has taken us so many years to make, and I think that I never ever thought about this part of the process. I always thought about, you know, finishing the film, but then I didn't necessarily think about what came next, you know? And that sounds like really weird, because like, why would you make a film if you wouldn't think about this bit of the process? But I generally had no idea how it would
I
all.
think to preserve your own sanity, right? So
Yeah, I think
if you
so.
kind of made the film thinking about the press tour, probably freak you out.
Yeah, I never thought about any of this stuff. So it just feels like super surreal. Like, you know, the film being selected for London Film Festival, a festival that I've attended for the best part of like 12 years as a fan. You know, I've watched some incredible films at the festival. Like, it's a ritual to sort of, you know, like look at the program and then like buy my tickets and sort of just go and get lost in film for 2 weeks. So the fact that this is all happening is so bizarre and so insane. But like, we're really privileged because it's a really hard year for sort of like independent film, and lots of stuff has been shelved or just hasn't come out or delayed. So the fact that we've managed to get this film out, and it's been received in the way that it's been received, is just like, yeah, I've kind of filled with lots of gratitude. I mean, it is a bit weird like reading, you know, because like people write stuff on Twitter and like they might not have necessarily like liked the film or like understood certain choices, and that's a bit, yeah, it's a bit of a weird. I generally try not to do it, but then there's something quite just, you know, perverse about like reading someone like trash your film a little bit, like, do you know what I mean? Yeah, so that's strange, like just like hearing like reviews that are not great. But yeah, it's like, what I mean is that you could read 100 reviews and they're all like pretty decent, and then there's like one or two that are not great, and then you just kind of get fixated on those two. So it's just weird, basically, just operating in sort of like a social media time when you've worked on something for so long and then everyone has opinion about it. But yeah, it's fine. I'm just happy the film's out there and it's hopefully getting to find an audience.
We have had another question through from another filmmaker, No City UK, who has asked a kind of quite detailed question, and we'll do Nosa's question, and then we'll kind of begin to wrap up. But she says, "Hey, Yemi, did you delve into the psychology of this sneaker addicted culture and why people in the culture feel like they had to get those specific shoes? Not to glorify the violence at all, but there's a whole subculture of resellers and collectors and young up and coming designers who grew up with Jordans themselves. So in your research and talking to the contributors, did you come across any specific themes to do with this that kept coming up?" Having seen the film, like you do kind of address some of those things in the film, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the sort of themes that came up through the research, and how you factored those in.
Yeah, I kind of, you know, I kind of essentially feel that this is like a marketing story. And I think that Nike and brand Jordan, and sort of like Nike and their collaboration with Michael Jordan was basically the foundation of everything that we have today in terms of like personalities or athletes or musicians endorsing stuff. So it kind of like felt like the blueprint of everything. So I knew that I wanted to explore that, but our timeline only kind of like goes to a certain period. So I think the whole reseller kind of like hype culture aspect of it, I think some of it is detailed in the third act of the film, but not sort of like present day sort of like hype culture sort of stuff. So yeah, I knew that I wanted to explore it. I knew that it was going to essentially be a marketing story, and how the marketing of this shoe kind of like connected to other things in society in America at that time. And I knew that the back end of the story would be a little bit broader, because it would talk about, you know, almost like present day, how much these sneakers are worth in terms of like, you know, the basis and the onus that people place on them, and where that has come from. But I kind of feel that it just all revolves around, you know, the marketing of the shoes. I think that, you know, Michael Jordan was the god of basketball at one point, and the greatest basketball player ever. And Nike saw an opportunity to sort of, you know, turn that into a gold rush, because no human being could do what Michael Jordan was doing on a basketball court. So no human being could emulate that, but you could sort of like have the shoes that he was kind of like doing these incredible things on the basketball court in and, you know, winning all of these championships. So yeah, I kind of feel, if that answers the question, I knew that it would be in a roundabout way about marketing and how it linked to everything else.
Yeah, I think like sort of the question is really interesting and kind of touches on the sort of psychology of people who are obsessed with with trainers who are sneakerheads.
Yeah, but I think also, I remembered a point that I was trying to make. It's about like just our love affair with consumerism, isn't it? It's about our love for things and how that connects to the way that we are marketed things. And, you know, this idea of need versus desire, like, and want, and all of those things. It is, yeah, it's about the psychology of marketing and how we respond to those things.
Psychology of capitalism.
100%. We're all kind of in it. We're all part of it, I think.
We're nearly out of time, so I'll kind of ask you my last question before we say our goodbyes, which is really, you know, for any filmmakers who are present on the call, what's one thing that you wish that you had known when you started out? Or what's one piece of wisdom that you'd like to impart on any filmmakers listening today?
Don't take anything personally, and like have complete faith in your idea, because I think it's easy to sort of, you know, listen to the noise of people, or, you know, not just people, but just things that perhaps tell you that, you know, you shouldn't be doing this, or this is just a wild idea, like why? But I think it's about having complete, you know, conviction in the thing that you're trying to do, and just being strong enough to sort of, you know, block out all the noise, and just having, you just have to be persistent, and just be kind to yourself in you know, in respect of like, it might take a bit of time, but as long as you believe in this one thing and you're willing to sort of put the work in, it will definitely come to fruition. Do you know what I mean? And that's the only thing, because there were definitely moments where I was just kind of like, oh my God, like this is never, you know, in March when South by got cancelled, I was just like, well, this film's never going to come out. It's like 7 years of making it. This was kind of like, South by was a lottery win for us. It was like we won the lottery getting into that festival. It was a top tier North American film festival, and it was meant to be the launch pad for the film, and it got cancelled. And it got cancelled at a time when we didn't really know what this virus was, and it kind of all felt a bit hysterical. So it was 100% that, you know, the right thing to cancel it. But yeah, I kind of just feel that you just have to be patient and have persistence and just have conviction in the idea and the story and the characters that will orbit your idea and that you're trying to document. And just, yeah, just don't take stuff personally, because people might say things not knowing really what they're saying in relation to you know, your faith and your belief in this idea. And I just kind of feel that, yeah, just believe in yourself and just quiet that little voice sometimes that gets loud, that asks you that you're crazy for trying to do this.
I think that's all really useful advice. You know, have a thick skin, keep being persistent, and don't forget why you're making the film in the first place. I think that's all really useful takeaways. If you haven't watched the film yet, you can still watch it. It's on the LFF player. There's a link in the chat box for the kind of continuing LFF screenings. I think it's playing until tomorrow, and then it's on general release the following week. So if you haven't watched it, go and watch it. Thank you, Yemi, and thanks to the network. And I hope it was useful for any filmmakers listening.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for turning up today.
No worries. Thanks, guys.